The Unfolding Dawn, a saga of two worlds in early America. 6. The Pilgrims' Covenant, Faith, Freedom, and the Mayflower Voyage. The history of English North America, begun in the swampy avarice of Jamestown, took a profoundly different turn 13 years later on the rocky, wind-battered coast of New England. If Jamestown was born of the desperate hunt for gold and the pursuit of enterprise, the Plymouth colony was conceived in the furnace of religious conviction and the unwavering belief in divine purpose. This second, foundational chapter in the American saga, the story of the Pilgrims, is not one of adventurers seeking fortunes, but of exiles seeking the freedom to worship God in the purity of their own conscience. A quest that defined the political and spiritual trajectory of the northern colonies. The seed of separatism, a conscience in conflict. The people who would become known as the Pilgrims were not merely nonconformists. They were separatists, a radical faction within the broader Puritan movement in England. They fundamentally rejected the Church of England, viewing it as hopelessly corrupted by Roman Catholic practices and insisting that its structure and rituals lacked biblical justification. Their position, that they must separate entirely from the established state church, was deemed treasonous and subversive by the English crown. Under the reign of King James I, whose motto was, "No bishop, no king," such religious dissent was ruthlessly suppressed. The separatists faced fines, imprisonment, and public scorn for refusing to swear allegiance to the monarch as the head of the church. This persecution forced a small congregation, primarily farmers and artisans from the village of Scrooby, to make a radical decision, self-exile. In 1608, seeking both religious peace and physical safety, they escaped England and settled in the Netherlands, first in Amsterdam and then permanently in Leiden. The Dutch crucible, Leiden, offered them the peace they craved. They established a thriving community and enjoyed complete religious freedom. However, the move presented a new, insidious threat: cultural assimilation. Their children, growing up amidst the Dutch language and customs, were beginning to drift away from the English faith and heritage their parents held so dear. Furthermore, the relentless, grueling labor required to compete in the Dutch textile industry proved physically exhausting, leaving them impoverished and aging rapidly. The congregation's leaders, including William Brewster and William Bradford, who would later write the definitive history of the colony, determined that a second, far more drastic migration was necessary. They resolved to cross the Atlantic to the remote, unclaimed reaches of North America. Their goal was twofold: to establish a settlement where they could practice their faith unmolested, and, crucially, to maintain their distinct English identity and language for the sake of their posterity. They viewed this but as a spiritual covenant with God, testing their faith in the vast and unforgiving wilderness. To fund this immense undertaking, they secured a patent from the Virginia Company and formed a business agreement with a group of London investors known as the Merchant Adventurers. This financial arrangement dictated that the Pilgrims would work communally for 7 years, sending back timber, furs, and other goods in repayment for their passage. This corporate requirement meant their colony would have to be an economic venture as much as a spiritual one, a factor that would breed conflict from the start. The perilous passage, 66 days to the New World. The journey began with logistical troubles. The Pilgrims bought a small ship, the Speedwell, to sail from Holland, and chartered the larger, slower merchant vessel, the Mayflower, to meet them in England. The Speedwell proved hopelessly unseaworthy, springing repeated leaks. After 2 false starts that wasted precious time and money, the Speedwell was abandoned. As a result, 102 passengers, a mix of the dedicated separatist saints, about 40 individuals, and hired secular laborers, servants, and adventurers known as the strangers, about 60 individuals, were crammed aboard the single, aging Mayflower. The 66-day transatlantic voyage, beginning on September 6, 1620, was an ordeal of unimaginable hardship. The conditions were brutally cramped and unsanitary. Passengers were confined to the dank, dark, and frigid 'tween decks, enduring relentless seasickness and the constant threat of being crushed by shifting cargo. Mid-ocean, they were battered by fierce autumnal storms that nearly tore the ship apart. A main beam cracked, leading the crew to fear the voyage would have to be aborted. Only the ingenuity of the passengers, who used a large iron jack, a tool brought for construction, to repair the beam, allowed the ship to proceed. Illness was rampant, though miraculously. Only 2 deaths occurred during the crossing, 1 crew member and 1 passenger, a low casualty rate for a voyage of that era. 1 child, Oceanus Hopkins, was born at sea. The length and intensity of the voyage consumed their already meager provisions and wore down the spirit of the travelers. They endured the relentless, suffocating presence of one another, the pious separatists praying constantly for deliverance alongside the boisterous, profane strangers hired for their labor. When, after 2 months, land was finally sighted on November 9, 1620, it was an emotional deliverance, a sign that God had indeed preserved His chosen people through the trials of the deep. The covenant of governance, the Mayflower Compact. However, their relief was quickly replaced by political anxiety. Their patent from the Virginia Company authorized settlement in the Virginia Territory, roughly the region near the Hudson River. Instead, due to navigational errors, unfavorable winds, or perhaps deliberate misdirection by the ship's master, the Mayflower had anchored far north, off the coast of Cape Cod, in what was effectively unclaimed territory outside any legal jurisdiction. This geographical error ignited a political crisis. The strangers, particularly the hired laborers, who had little loyalty to the Pilgrims' religious mission, argued that since they were outside the bounds of the original charter, they were free men and unbound by any authority, threatening mutiny and proclaiming they would use their own liberty to prevent the dissolution of their collective and avoid anarchic chaos in the harsh wilderness. The Pilgrim leaders acted decisively. While the ship was still anchored off Cape Cod, they drafted and signed the Mayflower Compact on November 11, 1620. The document itself is strikingly brief, consisting of fewer than 200 words. Yet its historical significance is monumental. It stated that the signatories, 41 of the 102 adult males aboard the ship, did solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic. The significance of the compact. Self-governance by consent. The Mayflower Compact was not a full constitution, but a foundational commitment to govern themselves by creating just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. This was a revolutionary act. These men were establishing government based on the mutual consent of the governed, not on the decree of a monarch or the authority of a church, but on a collective civil covenant, bridging the divide. The compact successfully bound the saints and the strangers into a temporary political unit, compelling all members of the expedition to submit to the collective welfare of the group. It ensured that the Pilgrims' goal of establishing a stable, godly community could proceed, overriding the commercial and religious differences of the passengers. The American trajectory. As the first written framework for government established in North America, the Mayflower Compact foreshadowed the later American emphasis on written law, popular sovereignty, and the concept of the covenant, a sacred, mutually binding agreement, as the basis for political life. It provided the legal and moral authority necessary to explore and settle the land. The first winter, the crucible of death, 1620 to 1621. After signing the compact, the Pilgrims spent weeks sailing around the bay, searching for a suitable place to settle. On December 18, 1620, December 28. New style, they finally selected a location they named Plymouth, near the site of a prior indigenous village that had been decimated by disease. The landing itself, often mythologized with the Plymouth Rock, was immediately followed by the task of building crude shelters in the deepening cold. Their physical unpreparedness was shocking. They had arrived with inadequate clothing, poor quality weapons, and minimal knowledge of how to sustain themselves in the New England climate. Their obsession with the interior life had left them woefully ignorant of the requirements of the wilderness. The months that followed were a living hell. The first winter of 1620 to 1621 quickly became known as the Great Sickness, or the Dying Time. The combination of malnutrition, scurvy, pneumonia, and sheer exhaustion swept through the ill-equipped settlement. At one point, only 6 or 7 able-bodied people remained to care for the sick, fetch water, and bury the dead. William Bradford recorded the catastrophic losses. Over the course of just 3 months, nearly half of the original passengers died. Only 53 of the 102 survived, including just 4 of the 18 wives who made the journey. Yet, in their deep Christian faith, the survivors interpreted this devastating loss not as God's abandonment, but as the ultimate trial, a test of their spiritual resolve and a sign that those who remained were truly the chosen remnant. They diligently hid the extent of their casualties from local native tribes, burying the dead at night in unmarked graves and leveling the earth so that potential enemies would not discover how few remained. The winter was a stark, brutal winnowing that solidified the communal bonds of the survivors and redefined their reliance on God's will. Diplomacy and survival, the Wampanoag Alliance. The spring of 1621 brought salvation not only in the form of warmer weather but in the form of a fragile, crucial peace brokered with the local indigenous inhabitants. The Pilgrims' survival depended entirely on this shift from isolation to diplomacy. On March 16, 1621, a native man walked boldly into the Plymouth settlement, speaking broken English. His name was Samoset, an Abenaki chief who had learned the language from English fishermen working further north. Samoset returned a few days later with a second pivotal figure, Tisquantum, or Squanto. Squanto's story was extraordinary and tragic. He was a member of the Patuxet Band, the very people who had lived on the land where Plymouth was now built. Years earlier, he had been kidnapped by an English captain named Thomas Hunt and sold into slavery in Spain. After escaping, he made his way to London and eventually worked his passage back to North America, only to find his entire Patuxet community had been wiped out by a devastating plague, likely leptospirosis or smallpox, carried by earlier European explorers between 1616 and 1619. Squanto was literally the last surviving member of the village of Plymouth. Squanto's unique experience, his ability to speak English and his intimate knowledge of the land, made him an instrument of divine providence in the eyes of the Pilgrims. They viewed him as a special instrument sent of God for their good. Squanto taught them essential survival skills: how to fish the local waters, how to recognize edible and medicinal plants, and, most critically, how to plant corn successfully in the thin New England soil, specifically advising them to fertilize the earth with fish, aloes. This crucial relationship led to a formal treaty with Massasoit Usamaquin, the powerful sachem, chief, of the nearby Wampanoag Confederacy. Massasoit's motivation was political. His Wampanoag people had also been decimated by the recent plague, severely weakening them against their powerful rivals, the Narragansett, who had been untouched by the sickness. By forming an alliance with the English, who possessed steel weapons and, more importantly, the fearful ability to summon the diseases that had killed his rivals, Massasoit gained military protection and leverage. The resulting treaty, signed in March 1621, was a defensive agreement based on mutual promises of non-aggression. and military support against external enemies. It held firm for over 50 years and was the single greatest guarantee of Plymouth's survival and stability. The harvest and the covenant fulfilled. In the autumn of 1621, thanks to Squanto's guidance and Massasoit's peace, the Pilgrims reaped their first successful harvest. To celebrate their survival and success, and to show gratitude to their allies, Governor Bradford organized a harvest feast. Massasoit and 90 Wampanoag men joined the 50 remaining English settlers for 3 days of feasting, games, and diplomacy. This event, often sanitized and mythologized, was not the start of a perfect friendship, but a hard-won political celebration. A moment where the spiritual mission of the Pilgrims was tangibly fulfilled. Through the grace of God and the practical necessity of the native alliance, the Pilgrims had survived their crucible. They had established their city upon a hill. Though this phrase belongs to the later Massachusetts Bay Puritans, the sentiment was the same, not by conquest or gold, but by covenant, cooperation, and grim, tenacious endurance. They had transformed a voyage of religious freedom into a successful settlement, providing the crucial model for the subsequent, much larger wave of religious colonization that would flood New England and profoundly shape the future culture, politics, and religious identity of America. The Unfolding Dawn, a saga of two worlds in early America. 7. The unwilling immigrants, exile, convicts, and indentured servitude. The narrative of early American colonization is frequently dominated by the heroic tales of the Mayflower Pilgrims and the ambitious gentlemen of Jamestown. Yet, the physical and economic foundations of the British North American colonies were not laid by pious religious exiles or gold-seeking gentry, but by a vast, silent, and often unwilling workforce, the bound laborers. For nearly 150 years, the vast majority of immigrants who crossed the Atlantic were not free agents seeking a fresh start, but men, women, and children whose bodies and labor were owned, temporarily or permanently, by others. This massive flow of indentured servants, transported convicts, and political exiles represents a hidden, brutal history of systemic exploitation that fueled the economic engines of the southern colonies. It was a history defined by the relentless, insatiable demand for labor, a demand so great it consumed the lives of millions and permanently shaped the social, racial, and economic structure of the fledgling nation. To understand the genesis of the Southern plantation system and the eventual rise of race-based chattel slavery, one must first confront the lives and contributions of the unwilling immigrants who constituted the backbone of the colonial economy. The crisis of labor and opportunity. The 17th century presented a profound paradox for the English colonies. Immense, untapped land resources coupled with an utter lack of available labor. The cash crops that proved profitable, first, tobacco in the Chesapeake, Virginia and Maryland, and later rice and indigo in the Carolinas, were intensely labor-intensive and required massive, coordinated effort to plant, tend, and harvest. The small populations of early free settlers simply could not meet this demand. Simultaneously, the economic and social landscape of 17th century England provided the perfect push factor. The enclosure movement, recurring economic depressions, high urban poverty, and demographic shifts created a massive, disposable population of young, often unemployed workers, particularly in the cities. For the English poor, America was viewed not as a land of opportunity, but as a last, desperate resort. It offered a harsh but seemingly finite contract that was marginally better than perpetual poverty, debt, or the gallows. The colonies were divided by the labor-required New England, with its mixed economy of fishing, trade, and small-scale farming, rarely used large numbers of bound laborers. It was the southern colonies and the Caribbean sugar islands where vast tracts of land were dedicated to monoculture cash crops that developed the insatiable need for bound labor, establishing a system of human trafficking and exploitation long before chattel slavery became dominant. Indentured servitude, the Great Exchange. The system of indentured servitude, where a laborer agreed to work for a set term in exchange for the cost of passage to the New World, became the primary solution to the colonial labor crisis. It was, in theory, a voluntary contract. In reality, it was often a Hobson's choice driven by dire necessity. The mechanics of the indenture contract. The process began when a young, poor English person, often between the ages of 15 and 25, and overwhelmingly male, signed a formal indenture contract. This contract legally bound them to a master for a period typically lasting 4 to 7 years. In exchange, the master or the planter received the services of the laborer for the duration of the contract, paid for their transatlantic passage, and promised to provide meat, drink, apparel, and lodging. The contract itself was a transferable commercial asset. The servant was, in all but name, temporary property, and the contract could be, and frequently was, sold or bequeathed to another master. This system was directly linked to the headright system pioneered in Virginia, which granted 50 acres of land to anyone who paid for an immigrant's passage. This legal incentive created a massive, self-sustaining financial infrastructure dedicated to importing bound labor. Ship captains and merchants became middlemen, selling both the passage and the contract, the servant's labor. Upon arrival in the colonies, the reality of servitude. The experience of the average indentured servant was brutal, characterized by overwork, deprivation, and vulnerability. The terms of their service were enforced by colonial courts, and punishments for running away, insubordination, or minor offenses were severe, often including public whipping, physical branding, and, critically, the addition of extra years onto their term of service. This created a vicious cycle of punishment and extended bondage. The work on the tobacco plantations of Virginia and Maryland was ceaseless and physically demanding, overseen by harsh overseers. Diseases rampant in the swampy, hot climate ensured a terrifying mortality rate. Historical data suggests that in the early 17th century, nearly 50% of indentured servants died before completing their term, often within the first 2 years. This made the passage to the colonies an effective death sentence for millions. Yet the system remained profitable, because the cost of passage was low compared to the value of several years of life-consuming labor. The mirage of freedom dues. For those few who survived their full term, the indentured contract promised freedom dues, a final payment designed to help them start their new lives as free colonists. This typically consisted of a small grant of land, if the colony still had available plots, a small sum of money, clothing, and basic tools. However, the reality of the freedom dues was often a cruel mockery. The land grants were often remote, difficult to farm, or located near Native American territories, making them dangerous and unprofitable. Lacking capital and weakened by years of brutal labor, many former servants quickly fell back into poverty or debt, becoming a landless, dissatisfied class. This simmering resentment among the freed laborers, white men who still viewed themselves as culturally and racially superior to Native Americans and Africans, yet were barred from economic success, was a major source of colonial unrest, eventually exploding into violence in events like Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, the forced cargo, convicts and political exiles, alongside the voluntary, yet desperate, indentured servants, were two groups whose immigration was entirely compelled by the state, the transported convicts and the political exiles. These individuals truly represent the unwilling immigrants, used by the British government primarily to cleanse its cities and fill colonial labor needs. Simultaneously, the rise of convict transportation, the practice of sending criminal offenders to the colonies, began in the 17th century, but it was formalized by the Transportation Act of 1718. This legislation transformed penal policy by replacing the death penalty or lengthy prison sentences for many non-capital felonies, crimes that didn't involve murder or high treason, with mandatory penal servitude in the colonies for 7 or 14 years. The types of crimes that earned a one-way trip across the Atlantic were often related to poverty, petty theft, robbery, and the theft of property, e.g., stealing a piece of linen or a few shillings. The social justice implications were immense. Poor people were transported for crimes born of necessity, while the wealthy could often buy their way out of punishment. The scale of this operation was staggering. Between 1718 and the start of the American Revolution in 1775, Britain transported an estimated 50,000 to 70,000 convicts to its North American colonies. The primary destinations were Maryland and Virginia, where they were immediately sold at auction to planters, shipbuilders, and iron masters. The convicts' fate. The convicts' experience was significantly worse than that of a voluntary servant. Their term of service was longer, usually 7 years, often 14. The work was typically the hardest and most dangerous, and they received no freedom dues at the end of their service. Furthermore, escape was treated as a capital offense. Convicts were often viewed with contempt and fear by the free colonists, who saw them as a source of corruption and disorder, a stark contrast to the religious image the northern colonies tried to project. The political exiles. Political prisoners were another group forced into colonial servitude. These were individuals captured following rebellions or civil conflicts against the crown. Their transportation was not about rehabilitation or cleansing London streets, but about neutralizing political threats and selling the defeated into profitable bondage. Notable groups include the Irish, 1650s. Following Oliver Cromwell's brutal conquest of Ireland, thousands of Irish men, women, and children were forcibly shipped to the West Indies and mainland colonies like Barbados and Virginia. The Scots, 1680s and 1715-1745. Thousands of Scottish soldiers and rebels captured during the Jacobite uprisings, Scots who supported the Catholic Stuart claim to the throne, were transported to the colonies, primarily as a form of permanent, forced exile. These political prisoners often had a higher social status than common convicts or poor servants, but their ultimate fate was the same: forced labor on tobacco or sugar plantations, often with lifelong contracts. The crucible of the southern plantations. The vast majority of the unwilling immigrants were funneled into the southern plantation economy. The demand for labor was relentless, driven by the global market for tobacco and sugar. The environment, humid, disease-ridden, and characterized by intensive field labor, was merciless. The mortality rates were highest in the West Indies, where bound laborers were often worked to death on the immensely profitable sugar cane plantations, while slightly less lethal on the North American mainland. The combination of exhausting labor, inadequate diet, harsh discipline, and endemic disease meant the servitude system was one of constant human turnover. Planters preferred this system, as it kept the cost of labor low. The cost of buying a 4-year contract was far less than the cost of maintaining a free, salaried worker. The racial transition. The late 17th century marked a critical turning point in the use of bound labor, driven partly by the unrest of the poor white laboring class. Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, in Virginia was a defining moment. This revolt saw a coalition of poor former indentured servants, current servants, and enslaved Africans rise up against the wealthy planter elite. The sight of armed, unified, landless white and black laborers terrified the ruling class. Furthermore, economic factors came into play. As conditions in England slowly improved in the early 18th century, the flow of willing indentured servants dwindled. Concurrently, the Royal African Company's monopoly ended, making the purchase of enslaved African labor more economically viable and reliable. The temporary contract of the servant was replaced by the permanent, hereditary status of the slave. By the mid-18th century, particularly in the Deep South like South Carolina, the bound labor system was almost entirely race-based. The economic function of the indentured servant and the convict had been entirely subsumed by the institution of race-based chattel slavery, completing the brutal transition to America's defining labor system. The legacy of the unwilling. The unwilling immigrants, the indentured servants, convicts, and political exiles form a crucial, often forgotten, demographic foundation of the early United States. Their contribution. They were the human capital that financed the development and cleared the vast acreage of the colonial frontier. They constructed the first homes, laid out the first roads, and performed the backbreaking labor in the fields that created the wealth. For the planter elite, many of the Appalachian and frontier populations in the 18th century were descended from these freed servants who finally made good on their freedom dues. They were instrumental in establishing the economic viability of the southern colonies, creating the tobacco and rice empires that generated immense wealth for Britain and the American gentry. Their enduring impact. The experience of the unwilling immigrant left a deep mark on colonial society. Social stratification, the system solidified a powerful, self-perpetuating planter aristocracy while creating a permanent underclass of poor white laborers and farmers, a class that often viewed its only advantage as its racial difference from the enslaved population. Penal system, the practice of convict transportation merely shifted, rather than ended, with the Revolution. When America closed its doors to British convicts, the UK simply rerouted its penal transport to Australia, leading to the creation of another major colony built on involuntary servitude. The story of the willing religious refugee and the adventurous gentleman is only one part of the American Genesis. The story of the unwilling immigrant, the person whose only asset was a body to be sold for passage, is the more profound, if darker, truth about the labor systems that ultimately funded the revolution and created the wealth of the future American Republic. The Unfolding Dawn, a saga of two worlds in early America. 8. Conflict and contagion, wars for the continent's soul. The arrival of Europeans in North America was not merely an encounter between disparate cultures. It was the genesis of a long, brutal, and often genocidal struggle for the very soul of a continent. While early narratives often romanticize initial peaceful interactions, the underlying reality was one of escalating tensions, broken treaties, and a relentless tide of colonial expansion that inevitably led to devastating wars. These conflicts were not just battles over land. They were existential clashes between fundamentally different worldviews, exacerbated and ultimately decided by the silent, invisible killer that preceded and accompanied the European advance, disease. The history of these wars for the continent's soul cannot be understood without acknowledging the devastating impact of European pathogens, which often cleared the path for conquest long before a single shot was fired. The unseen weapon, a biological apocalypse. Before the English, French, or Spanish swords could strike, an unseen enemy had already begun its terrible work. European diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, bubonic plague, cholera, and leptospirosis, to which indigenous populations had no acquired immunity, swept across the Americas with apocalyptic ferocity. The land was not a virgin wilderness waiting to be discovered, but a widowed wilderness already reeling from a biological catastrophe. Pre-contact plagues, the empty lands. Archaeological and historical evidence now strongly suggests that major epidemics ravaged parts of North America decades, even a century, before sustained European settlement. The Patuxet village, where the Pilgrims would establish Plymouth, was a grim testament to this. Tisquantum, Squanto, the lone survivor, returned to find his entire community wiped out by a plague, likely leptospirosis, between 1616 to 1619, carried by earlier European explorers or fishermen along the coast. This epidemic cleared the way for the Pilgrims, allowing them to settle on cleared land with little initial resistance. Similarly, the arrival of Hernando de Soto's expedition in the American Southeast, 1539 to 1542, unleashed a wave of disease that devastated the sophisticated Mississippian chiefdoms. While de Soto's men certainly caused direct casualties, the lasting and far more destructive impact was the pathogens they carried. Within a century, many of the complex, hierarchical Mississippian societies had collapsed, leaving behind only remnants and vast empty ceremonial sites, ghosts of once thriving populations. The cycle of devastation, intentional and unintentional. These diseases acted as a cruel vanguard for colonization. They destabilized native political structures, shattered social cohesion, decimated populations, often 70 to 90% mortality rates, and broke spiritual belief systems, as traditional healers struggled against an unknown and invincible enemy. While largely unintentional, there were documented instances where disease was viewed, and even actively used, as a tool of war. The most infamous example, though from a later period, is Lord Geoffrey Amherst's suggestion during Pontiac's Rebellion, 1763, to distribute smallpox-infected blankets to hostile tribes, regardless of intent. The biological disparity was the single most powerful factor in European success, creating a demographic vacuum that invited further expansion. Early skirmishes, seeds of resentment, 17th century. As colonial populations grew, so did their hunger for land, inevitably leading to clashes with native nations. The initial phase of conflict was characterized by localized, often brutal, engagements. The Pequot War, 1637, New England. The Pequot War stands as one of the earliest and most brutal conflicts between English colonists and Native Americans in New England. The Pequot were a powerful, wealthy tribe in what is now southeastern Connecticut, controlling vital trade routes. Growing Puritan settlements in the Connecticut River Valley encroached on Pequot land, leading to escalating tensions over trade, hunting grounds, and isolated acts of violence. The immediate spark was the murder of a controversial English trader, John Stone, in 1634, and later a retaliatory attack and murder of another trader, John Oldham, in 1636, by a band associated with the Pequots. Puritan leaders, already wary of Pequot power and desiring their land, used these incidents as justification for war. In May 1637, a combined force of Connecticut and Massachusetts Bay militias, allied with hundreds of Narragansett and Mohegan warriors, tribes who were traditional rivals of the Pequot, launched a decisive attack. Under the command of Captain John Mason, the English and their allies surrounded a fortified Pequot village at Mystic. In a horrific dawn raid, the village was set ablaze. As the Pequots fled the burning palisade, they were shot down by the English, or cut down by the Narragansett and Mohegan, who, despite their alliance, were reportedly shocked by the ferocity and totality of the English assault. The aftermath: hundreds of Pequots, primarily women, children, and the elderly, were massacred. Survivors were hunted down, enslaved, or absorbed into other tribes. The Treaty of Hartford, 1638, officially dissolved the Pequot nation, banning their name and erasing them from the map. The Puritan leaders interpreted their victory as a sign of God's divine favor. solidifying their belief in their right to the land. The Pequot War served as a terrifying precedent, demonstrating the colonists' willingness to wage total war, and the devastating consequences of tribal disunity in the face of colonial aggression. The Anglo-Powhatan Wars, 1610 to 1646, Virginia. In the Chesapeake, the struggle unfolded between the burgeoning Jamestown colony and the powerful Powhatan Confederacy. The initial years were marked by a desperate dependency of the starving English on Powhatan corn, followed by increasing encroachment on native lands as the English discovered the profitability of tobacco. The first major conflict, the First Anglo-Powhatan War, 1610 to 1614, began after Lord de la Warre's arrival and a period of intensified English aggression. It was a brutal conflict, characterized by scorched earth tactics from the English, burning villages and fields. A temporary peace was achieved with the marriage of Pocahontas, Rebecca, to John Rolfe. However, this peace was fragile and artificial. After Chief Powhatan's death, his successor, Opechancanough, launched the devastating Great Uprising of 1622. This coordinated surprise attack on Good Friday killed nearly a third of the English population, over 300 settlers. The English retaliated with extreme brutality, using poisoned wine during a parley and systematically destroying Powhatan villages and crops, pushing them further from their lands. The final major conflict, the Third Anglo-Powhatan War, 1644 to 1646, saw another desperate attempt by Opechancanough to drive out the English. By this point, the demographic balance had decisively shifted, and the Powhatan Confederacy was severely weakened by disease and constant warfare. Opechancanough, now an elderly man carried on a litter, was captured and executed. The Treaty of 1646 effectively dissolved the Confederacy, confining the remaining Powhatan to small reservations and formally subjecting them to English rule. The once mighty Powhatan were reduced to a fragmented, subordinate people. The Great Eruption, King Philip's War, 1675 to 1678. The mid-17th century saw a period of relative peace in New England, largely due to the long-standing alliance between the Plymouth Colony and the Wampanoag Confederacy, forged by Governor Bradford and Massasoit Usamakwen after the First Thanksgiving. However, this peace began to fray dramatically after Massasoit's death in 1661. His son, Matacomet, known to the English as King Philip, inherited a very different world. English colonial populations had exploded, reaching over 50,000, dwarfing the remaining native populations. Land hunger was insatiable and aggressive. Puritan attempts to convert and control native people fueled deep resentment. The Wampanoag were being systematically dispossessed of their lands, their sovereignty eroded by colonial courts and laws. The spark and the alliance, the immediate catalyst for King Philip's War, 1675 to 1678, was the execution of 3 Wampanoag men by the Plymouth Colony for the murder of John Sassamon, a praying Indian, converted Native American, who had warned the colonists of Matacomet's impending war preparations. For Matacomet, this was the final insult, a direct challenge to Wampanoag sovereignty. Matacomet, recognizing the existential threat, worked tirelessly to forge a grand alliance of native nations, including the Wampanoag, Narragansett, Nipmuc, and others, to drive the English into the sea. This was not merely a territorial dispute, but a desperate pan-Indian effort to reclaim their lands and way of life before they were completely overwhelmed. Total war and devastation. King Philip's War was the most destructive conflict, relative to population size, in American history. It was a brutal, no-quarter struggle that devastated both sides. Native strategy. Matacomet's forces employed highly effective guerrilla tactics, launching coordinated raids on dozens of isolated colonial settlements. They burned towns, destroyed crops, and killed hundreds of colonists. The English frontier collapsed, with nearly half of New England's towns attacked, and a dozen completely destroyed. Colonial response: the English retaliated with extreme brutality, systematically destroying native villages, crops, and winter food supplies. They often massacred non-combatants and sold captured Native Americans into slavery in the West Indies. The English also successfully undermined Matacomet's alliance by recruiting some native groups, like the Mohegan and Pequot survivors, to fight against the Wampanoag. The fall of Matacomet and the legacy. The turning point came with the Great Swamp Fight, December 1675, where a combined colonial force attacked a large, fortified Narragansett village, killing hundreds of non-combatants and destroying their winter provisions. This crippled the Narragansett, a key ally of Matacomet. After 3 years of relentless fighting, the native alliance began to falter, weakened by starvation, disease, and the relentless English pressure. Matacomet's forces were eventually hunted down. In August 1676, Matacomet himself was cornered and killed by a praying Indian acting as a scout for the colonists. His body was dismembered. His head was displayed on a pike in Plymouth for 2 decades, a grim symbol of colonial victory. His wife and young son were sold into slavery. The legacy of King Philip's War. Demographic catastrophe. The war was a demographic catastrophe for New England's native populations, reducing them by 60 to 80%. Many who survived were enslaved, forced into servitude, or fled westward. Land consolidation: the war effectively cleared southern New England of native resistance, opening up vast tracts of land for unchecked colonial expansion. Racial polarization: the war intensified racial hatred, solidifying a view of Native Americans as savages who must be either eliminated or completely subjugated. This hardened the racial lines that would define future conflicts. Colonial unity: paradoxically, the shared trauma of the war temporarily fostered a sense of common identity among the disparate English colonies, forcing them to cooperate in a way they rarely did against a common enemy. Enduring conflict and the path forward. The Pequot War, the Anglo-Powhatan Wars, and King Philip's War were not isolated incidents but represent a continuous, escalating pattern of conflict driven by colonial expansion and the devastating effects of disease. They set the stage for centuries of further warfare, including the French and Indian War, Pontiac's Rebellion, and the countless smaller conflicts that would define the American frontier. The wars for the continent's soul irrevocably reshaped the demographic, political, and cultural landscape of North America. They stripped native nations of their sovereignty, decimated their populations, and paved the way for the eventual dominance of European colonial power. This violent genesis laid bare the stark reality that the dream of freedom for the European settlers often came at the unspeakable cost of dispossession, disease, and death for the continent's original inhabitants. This grim truth is an inseparable part of America's founding narrative. 9. A wilderness of plenty: colonial life and the rise of distinct identities. By the early 18th century, the tentative, struggling outposts of the 17th century, the chaotic Jamestown and the isolated Plymouth, had vanished. In their place stood 13 distinct, dynamic, and rapidly maturing colonies, stitched along the Atlantic seaboard. This was the era of the wilderness of plenty, a period of unprecedented economic success and demographic explosion fueled by a century of relentless labor and exploitation of the continent's resources. The defining characteristic of this mature colonial society, circa 1700 to 1760, was not uniformity, but sharp divergence. 3 geographically and culturally distinct regions had emerged, each forging unique economies, social hierarchies, and forms of local governance. Yet, underlying this regional diversity, a profound, non-European change was taking root. Separated from the mother country by 3,000 miles and generations of unique frontier experience, the colonists were slowly shedding their British skin. The combination of geographic distance, economic self-sufficiency, and evolving intellectual currents led to the quiet, organic birth of the American identity, a confidence in local rule and a sense of collective purpose that would, within decades, challenge the authority of the greatest empire on earth. The three pillars of colonial economy. The landscape dictated the destiny of each region, creating three distinct economic spheres that traded heavily with one another and were deeply integrated into the larger British mercantile system. The North, New England's commercial and religious core. The New England colonies, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, were geographically constrained by their rocky, thin soil, making large-scale agriculture unfeasible. This environmental challenge forced them to turn immediately to the sea and commerce, establishing a highly entrepreneurial culture focused on intellectual and mercantile pursuits. The maritime economy, New England, became the maritime and financial heart of the colonies. Its dense, accessible forests provided cheap timber, fueling a massive shipbuilding industry that produced nearly a third of all ships flying the British flag. This enabled them to control the colonial carrying trade. Whaling and fishing, especially cod, provided critical exports to Europe and the West Indies. The triangular trade, Boston, Salem, and Newport, anchored the infamous triangular trade. Ships would carry rum, distilled from West Indies molasses, to West Africa, exchange it for enslaved Africans, transport them via the Middle Passage to the West Indies, and return with sugar and molasses. While New England was not a plantation society, its immense commercial wealth was inextricably linked to the financing and logistics of the slave trade. A society of towns, economically, this region was characterized by small farmers and a large, skilled population of artisans, merchants, sailors, and craftsmen. This reliance on trade and the sea forged a cohesive, ambitious, and commercially minded society. The Middle Colonies, the breadbasket and melting pot. The Middle Colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, were blessed with fertile soil, moderate climate, and excellent river systems, the Hudson and Delaware. This combination made them the most geographically and culturally heterogeneous region. The agricultural hub, these colonies earned the moniker, the breadbasket of America. Farmers focused on large-scale cultivation of grains, wheat, corn, and barley, exporting vast quantities of flour and livestock to the West Indies and Europe. Their agricultural diversity insulated them somewhat from the boom and bust cycles of the South's single cash crops, commerce and manufacturing, beyond farming. Cities like Philadelphia, the largest city in the colonies by the mid-18th century, and New York City, became sophisticated commercial hubs, attracting skilled artisans, blacksmiths, millers, and manufacturers. The deep, navigable rivers facilitated internal and external trade. Economic pluralism. Their economy promoted a society of self-sufficient smallholders and diverse tradespeople, ensuring economic opportunity was spread more broadly than in the highly centralized North or the hierarchical South. This economic diversity mirrored their social structure, a melting pot of various ethnic and religious groups. The South, hierarchy, cash crops, and slavery. The southern colonies, Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, were defined by geography suited for large-scale, labor-intensive monoculture cash crops. The plantation economy, Virginia and Maryland relied overwhelmingly on tobacco, which created a planter elite and fueled insatiable land hunger. South Carolina, with its swampy coastal lands, became the center for rice and indigo, both immensely profitable but deadly to cultivate. The engine of slavery. The entire Southern economy was inextricably dependent on chattel slavery. The labor demands of tobacco, rice, and indigo far exceeded the capacity of indentured servitude. By the 18th century, the vast majority of the wealth generated In the South derived directly from the forced labor and reproduction of enslaved Africans. In areas like coastal South Carolina, enslaved Africans often outnumbered the white population, creating a society perpetually focused on control and maintaining the brutal racial hierarchy. Deep ties to Britain, Southern wealth was often measured in land and slaves. But financially, the planters were deeply entwined with British merchants, relying on them for credit, financing, and the sale of their massive crops. This reliance made them simultaneously the wealthiest colonists and often the most indebted to the mother country. 2. Governance, the practice of self-rule. The maturation of the colonial economy was matched by the maturation of its political structure. By the 18th century, the colonists had long ceased to be passive recipients of imperial policy. They were active, practiced agents of self-governance, far more involved in their political lives than the average British subject. New England, purist democracy. Local government in New England remained firmly rooted in the tradition of the town meeting. Every free male landowner could attend, debate, and vote on local budgets, ordinances, and the selection of officials. This was arguably the purest form of democracy in the colonies and fostered a highly engaged, informed citizenry. On the colonial level, elected assemblies were strong, relying on their religious mandate and cohesive society to assert power against the royally appointed governors. The South, oligarchy and decentralization. Southern governance was decentralized and aristocratic. Due to the vast distances between plantations, the effective unit of local governance was the county government, or parish. Elected officials and justices were typically drawn exclusively from the ranks of the planter elite. The colonial assemblies, like the House of Burgesses in Virginia, were dominated by powerful, wealthy families, an oligarchy, who used their elected positions to protect and expand their land and slave holdings. While outwardly democratic, real political power was tightly concentrated among a few hundred individuals. The power of the purse. Regardless of regional differences, all colonial assemblies had achieved one critical unifying power, the power of the purse. Over decades of political maneuvering, the assemblies had established their sole right to initiate tax, legislation, and appropriate funds for public services, including the salary of the royally appointed governor. This economic control gave the assemblies immense leverage over imperial authority. They were, in effect, self-ruling bodies that controlled the local destiny and finance of their territories, paying only rhetorical deference to the distant British Parliament. 3. The emerging American identity, the non-European mindset. The cumulative effect of economic success, practiced self-governance, and demographic separation led to the emergence of a distinctive American identity, a psychological and philosophical divergence from Britain that made the idea of revolution possible. The frontier experience and generational distance. The environment of the wilderness of plenty demanded adaptability, self-reliance, and physical resilience, traits that the colonists came to view as inherently superior to the perceived rigidity and effete culture of the English ruling class. Generations born in America viewed the mother country not as their home, but as a distant land. They spoke English, read English law, and consumed English goods. Yet their daily experience of managing land, confronting native resistance, and building wealth from scratch created a new cultural identity. They were English, yes, but American English, a distinction that carried the weight of superiority and self-determination. The intellectual tides, Enlightenment and Revival. This new psychological identity was formalized and validated by two powerful intellectual movements that swept the colonies. In the 18th century, the Enlightenment, European Enlightenment thinkers, Locke, Montesquieu, proposed radical concepts, natural rights, life, liberty, property, government based on social contract, and the separation of powers. These ideas resonated profoundly with the literate, politically active colonists, justifying their existing assemblies and giving them a formal language to critique arbitrary authority. The colonists came to believe their rights as free Englishmen were natural and inalienable, not grants from the king. The Great Awakening, beginning around the 1730s. This massive religious revival movement, featuring figures like George Whitefield, swept across the colonies, uniting them under a shared, fervent Protestant experience. It emphasized a personal, emotional relationship with God, often bypassing the established clergy and hierarchical church structures. This religious independence subtly undermined established political authority and fostered a sense of shared intercolonial experience, the first truly American mass movement that ignored colonial borders and social rank. By the mid-18th century, the American colonies were a study in contradictions. Religiously and ethnically diverse, economically powerful, and politically mature, the people had mastered their landscape, developed self-sustaining political institutions, and acquired a shared belief in their inherent right to liberty, codified by both religious revival and secular philosophy. The stage was set. America possessed the wealth, the political organs, and the philosophical justification to exist. Independent of the empire, all it needed was a catalyst. The Unfolding Dawn, a saga of two worlds in early America. 10. The Seeds of Republic, Liberty, Grievances, and the Road to Revolution. The thriving, mature colonies of the mid-18th century, profiled in the previous chapters, stood as a testament to American resilience, enterprise, and decentralized self-governance. By 1760, the colonists were the wealthiest people in the world, living under a political system where local assemblies wielded effective financial control. Yet, this stability was inherently fragile. The very success of the colonies, their economic maturity, political experience, and burgeoning sense of a unique identity, had brought them to an ideological precipice. The final concluding chapter of this saga is the story of how a generation of self-reliant, liberty-minded Americans transformed from loyal subjects of the British Crown into rebellious citizens of a nascent republic, driven by intellectual currents, political miscalculations, and an unyielding commitment to the principle of no taxation without representation. The intellectual foundation, the Age of Enlightenment. The philosophical groundwork for the American Revolution was meticulously laid not by muskets, but by minds. The 18th century Age of Enlightenment provided the colonists with a vocabulary, a logical framework, and the intellectual justification necessary to challenge monarchical and parliamentary authority. John Locke and Natural Rights. The most influential Enlightenment thinker in the American context was the English philosopher John Locke, 1632 to 1704. Locke's work, particularly two treatises of government, provided the ultimate challenge to the divine right of kings by positing the concept of natural rights. Locke argued that all men were born with inherent God-given rights to life, liberty, and property. Critically, Locke introduced the idea of the social contract. Governments derived their legitimacy solely from the consent of the governed. If a government ceased to protect the fundamental natural rights of its citizens, the people not only had the right, but the duty to overthrow that government and establish a new one. This idea resonated deeply with American colonists who already practiced self-rule in their town meetings and colonial assemblies. They did not view their rights as privileges granted by the king, but as inherent, inalienable possessions. Republicanism and classical virtue. Alongside Locke's liberalism, the colonists embraced the tenets of republicanism, a political ideology rooted in the history of the ancient Roman Republic. Republicanism held that a just society required citizens to possess civic virtue, a selfless willingness to subordinate private personal interests to the public good. It warned against the dangers of corruption, luxury, and tyranny, viewing centralized power as inherently dangerous to liberty. The colonists saw the burgeoning aristocracy and increasing taxation of the British Parliament as clear evidence of the corruption that republicanism warned against, making their rebellion seem like a morally necessary struggle to preserve classical virtue. The Great Awakening and religious liberty. The intellectual currents were amplified by the emotional power of the Great Awakening. 1730s, 1740s. A massive religious revival. Preachers like George Whitefield emphasized a direct, personal relationship with God, bypassing the hierarchical authority of the established church. This encouraged a spirit of individual religious autonomy which seamlessly translated into political autonomy. If individuals could challenge religious authority, they certainly possessed the moral right to challenge the political authority of Parliament. The Awakening fostered a sense of intercolonial unity and common purpose that transcended local boundaries, forging a unified American identity capable of collective political action. The catalyst, the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. Paradoxically, the path to American independence began with a massive British victory. The French and Indian War, or 7 Years' War, drove the French out of North America and secured the continent east of the Mississippi for Britain. This military success, however, sowed the seeds of future conflict for two primary reasons. Colonial confidence. American militiamen fought alongside British regulars, realizing that the British Army was neither invincible nor culturally superior. This experience built colonial confidence and provided military experience to future leaders like George Washington. Imperial debt. The war was incredibly expensive, nearly doubling Britain's national debt. The British government, under the logic that the war had been fought to protect the colonists, decided that the colonists themselves must bear a greater share of the financial burden. This shift from mercantilism, regulating trade, to imperial taxation, became the central conflict. The grievances, taxation without representation. The core philosophical dispute that drove the colonies to war was encapsulated by the mantra, no taxation without representation. This was not merely a complaint about high taxes, but a fundamental constitutional argument about political rights and sovereignty. The Parliamentary Assault, 1764 to 1767. Parliament, viewing the colonies as financially immature subordinates, believed it possessed the absolute right to legislate for them, in all cases whatsoever. The doctrine of virtual representation. The colonists argued that because they did not elect representatives to Parliament, they could only be taxed by their own colonial assemblies. The following acts, designed to raise revenue and assert control, systematically alienated the colonists. The Sugar Act, 1764. An attempt to raise revenue by cracking down on smuggling and enforcing duties on sugar and molasses. It angered colonial merchants and introduced the concept of taxation for revenue, not just regulation. The Stamp Act, 1765. This was the first internal tax levied directly on the colonies. It required the purchase of specially stamped paper for all legal documents, newspapers, and playing cards. The Stamp Act directly affected colonial printers, lawyers, and merchants. Precisely the literate elite, capable of articulating effective political opposition. The colonial response was immediate and violent, led by organizations like the Sons of Liberty. The Townshend Acts, 1767. Taxes on imported goods like glass, lead, paper, and tea. The revenue was intended to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges, thereby making them independent of the colonial assemblies. Power of the purse. This struck at the heart of colonial self-governance and economic leverage. The sustained colonial resistance, marked by boycotts, petitions, and violence, successfully led to the repeal of most of these acts. But not before the damage was done. The cycle of British assertion, American resistance, and British retreat convinced the colonists that organized defiance could compel Parliament to back down. The Boston Incidents, 1770 to 1773. Tensions culminated in two pivotal events in Massachusetts, the hotbed of anti-imperial sentiment. The Boston Massacre, 1770. Following years of harassment of British troops stationed in Boston, a skirmish erupted where British soldiers fired into a crowd, killing 5 colonists. Though defended by John Adams, the incident was quickly transformed by propagandists like Paul Revere and Samuel Adams into a symbol of British tyranny and murderous intent, fueling anti-British sentiment across the colonies. The Boston Tea Party, 1773, in response to the Tea Act, which granted the struggling East India Company a monopoly on the tea trade, thereby undercutting colonial merchants. A group of Boston patriots disguised as Native Americans dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. This act of organized economic vandalism was the colonists' most dramatic challenge to imperial authority yet. The final steps, intolerable acts and independence. Parliament's reaction to the Boston Tea Party was decisive and punitive, pushing the colonies past the point of reconciliation. The Coercive Acts, 1774. Dubbed the Intolerable Acts by the Americans. These 4 measures were designed to isolate and punish Massachusetts. The Boston Port Act closed the port of Boston until the destroyed tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Government Act stripped Massachusetts of its charter, placing the colonial government entirely under British control and banning town meetings. The Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials to be tried in Britain, effectively giving them license to violate colonial law without fear of local accountability. The Quartering Act allowed British troops to be housed in private colonial buildings, far from isolating Massachusetts. The Intolerable Acts galvanized the other 12 colonies. They viewed the punishment of Massachusetts as a blueprint for their own eventual subjugation. Unity in the First Continental Congress. In response to the Intolerable Acts, colonial leaders convened the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in September. 1,774 delegates from 12 colonies, Georgia abstained, met not to declare independence, but to formulate a unified response to the Crown. They issued a Declaration of Rights, condemned the Intolerable Acts, and, most powerfully, organized the Continental Association, a non-importation and non-exportation agreement designed to enforce a total economic boycott of Britain until the grievances were addressed. This act of unified economic protest was a monumental step toward political cohesion. The shot heard round the world, April 1775. The final break came on April 19, 1775, in Massachusetts. British troops marched from Boston to Concord to seize colonial arms caches and arrest rebel leaders, including Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Colonial militiamen, the Minutemen, met the British at Lexington and Concord. An unknown shot was fired, initiating open combat. The British retreated under heavy fire, suffering heavy casualties along the way. This skirmish proved that the colonists were willing to fight and die for their political liberty. The American Revolution had begun. Common Sense and Final Declaration, 1776. Following a year of open warfare, the majority of colonists still hesitated to declare full independence, clinging to the hope of reconciliation. This changed with the publication of Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense. In January 1776, Paine's pamphlet was a brutal, eloquent assault on the legitimacy of monarchy itself. He argued, in plain language accessible to the common person, that reconciliation was impossible and that monarchy was an absurd form of government. Common Sense galvanized public opinion, shifting the debate from seeking political rights within the empire to demanding complete separation. The Second Continental Congress, Recognizing the irreversible tide of events, officially appointed a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence. Authored primarily by Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence was adopted on July 4, 1776. It was not merely a political statement, but the ultimate expression of the Enlightenment principles, beginning with a Lockean justification. Governments derive their power from the consent of the governed, and the failure of the king to protect the colonists. Natural rights necessitated revolution. Conclusion: the birth of the Republic. The decade from 1765 to 1776 was the final, rapid transformation of the colonial mindset. The colonists moved from pragmatic self-rule to ideological rebellion, driven by the belief that Parliament and the Crown were engaged in a deliberate plot to destroy their liberties and subject them to tyranny. The seeds planted by the Pilgrims' Covenant, nurtured by the economic success of the plantation system, and codified by Enlightenment philosophy, finally blossomed into the radical idea of a self-governing republic. The American Revolution was the violent culmination of a unique cultural and political evolution, a decisive break from the European tradition and the true final birth of the independent American identity.